Hello, dears, this is the Story Sculpt channel and you are listening to the story Descent by Mumtaz Shirin. This story is taken from the book KAHANI, Short Stories, by Pakistani Women, edited by Aamer Hussein in 2005. He looked up. A long flight of stairs led up, broad, white and shining. White stairs. Leading to the white rooms upstairs, which were bathed in light, the light up. There. They stood at the feet of the stairs. He and she. He looked up at the long flight. No, she couldn't go up. She couldn't climb all these steps in her condition. He said tenderly, "Let me carry you." She blushed and shook her head. "No, no. Fancy carrying me all the way up, and people looking on. I don't care." He stretched his arms towards her. But she pushed them aside protesting, "I can go up the stairs myself." "All right then, I'll just hold you for support." He put his arm round her shoulders and held her tight. Together they climbed the stairs, step by step. The steps, broad, white, shining, led up to the white room upstairs. There was light up there, where life was born. Pain shot through her, now, at short intervals. A few steps up and the pain became more intermittent and more severe, through her spine, her hips, her belly. Cold shivers ran down her whole body, beads of perspiration stood out on her forehead. He took out a handkerchief and mopped her face. "It will be over soon," he murmured tenderly. He held her close. "Just lean on me, put all your weight on me. There, that's right. It will ease you." She closed her eyes and let her head fall on his shoulder. Step by step they came up. The nurses took her in, he was asked to wait outside. Outside, he sat on a bench, it all seemed so sudden. He hadn't expected it, it was rather early. She had been all right that evening. He came home as usual, dead tired, and she greeted him with a tender, soothing smile. She was pained to see him dispirited and worn out. As usual she brought the pitcher and poured water as he washed his face and hands. What a dutiful wife! Feelings of love and gratitude surged up in his heart. He wished her to sit by him and talk to him of the old happy days. But she said he should have his supper first, he looked so weak and exhausted. She laid the supper. He and the children sat down to their meager meal. She went into the kitchen, perhaps to see if there was anything else to give them, and then, he saw her clutch the door and sink onto the threshold. He left his food and ran to her. He picked her up and carried her to the bed. He asked her anxiously what the matter was. But she wouldn't tell him. It was always so with her. She tried to conceal her pain from him. But he could feel her pain. And then she had to tell him that it had started. He rushed her there. He hoped all would be well. How she had shivered in his arms as he brought her up the stairs. She must be suffering so terribly. She was so weak. There was hardly any strength left in her. Would she come out alive from this life and death struggle? Pain gripped his heart as he sat there outside, waiting. And she lay there, in the labor ward. The pains were now unbearable. Her eyes bulged out, she bit her lips hard. But she didn't moan, she didn't let a cry escape her lips. For he would know by her moaning that she was suffering terribly and he would suffer, too. She didn't utter a sound, she just suffered and suffered until she could suffer no more. She lost consciousness. He stood by the closed door. A madness had taken possession of him. He paced up and down, then he came back and sat on the bench, fidgeting restlessly. He stared into empty space with eyes that seemed not to see. But he strained his ears hard to catch a moan, a cry from the labor ward. Not a sound could be heard from there. All was still. Did it mean he was stabbed in the heart? Oh, God, God, let her live just this once. He prayed silently from the depth of his soul. They said that while a new life was being born out of her, the mother's own life was nearly extinguished. He strained his ears again. All was still as before. Maybe she was bearing with it. Patiently. She had borne it patiently, always. Maybe she was alive, she was all right. He sat on the bench, waiting endlessly, it seemed. Time stood still. The suffering, the pain, the torture of a lifetime was wrung into those few moments. And, inside, she lay still unconscious. It was a very tiny baby. Before the cord was cut from its navel, it was no more. Slowly, she gained consciousness. She didn't ask about the baby. Some hidden, unknown, vague feeling, the sixth sense, had warned her it was dead. The nurses comforted her. She shouldn't worry, it was always so with babies born in the 8th month. They rarely lived. A nurse brought the baby and held it for her to see. Slowly, she turned her head sideways. Just a look at that tiny pale face, tiny lifeless body, and 2 silent tears flowed down her cheeks. And the warm flow of motherly love that had surged up in her breast anew froze within her. The door opened and a nurse came out. He jumped to his feet and stared madly at the nurse. The nurse told him the baby had died as soon as it was born. He shouldn't worry, it was always so with babies born in the 8th month. But he wasn't thinking of the baby. Only if she were alive. Was she? The nurse went on, you shouldn't worry, you see, these babies rarely live. My wife? Your wife? Well, get her a cup of coffee. It will revive her a bit. Coffee for his wife? So she was alive. When he brought the coffee, he saw that she had been taken to another ward. She lay there quietly on the bed. He stood by her and watched her pale, weak body. How are you feeling now? He asked her softly, taking her cold, perspiring hand in his. She smiled faintly. I'm all right. But this time I'm too weak, you know. Every joint in my body aches. They didn't speak of the baby. He thought it was better so. She was saved and that was all he had wished for. The next morning he went to the hospital. He took the children with him too. She smiled at them. The children gathered round their mother's bed and he sat by her, holding her hand in his. She caught the anxious look in his eyes and pressed his hand reassuringly. Her eyes rested on his face. There was a wealth of tenderness and affection in them, love, devotion and silent worship. They had no physical attraction left, either of them. His loose, clumsy clothes dangled about his dark, bony form. She wore coarse, discolored clothes. She had lost her figure having borne many children. They were both worn out by hard work. They had no looks. Poverty had snatched away what little charm youth had given them. Once wheat brown, he had turned quite dark now. His cheeks had sunk in. She had a very pale yellow complexion, dark rings around her eyes sunk deep into their sockets. Hardly 25, she looked aged already. She was just wasting away. There was something other than beauty, a force stronger than physical attraction that had drawn them so together. The elders had joined their hands according to religious rites and from then on they belonged to each other. And she knew she ought to love her husband. He was her lord, she should worship him, and she loved him, worshipped him and devoted her life to his service. And he was aware that a weak, delicate being was given to his care, that he should protect her and support her. This weak being would share her life with him, she would be the mistress of his house, the mother of his children. And thus their hearts came together. Long communion had tended to make them what they were, it had deepened their affection and love for each other. And the children born of their love cemented the bond. The children could feel, too, that all was not well with their mother. Anxiously they inquired, Mother, are you not well? They felt her forehead. Is it fever? And the youngest one said so touchingly, Where is it that you are feeling pain, Mum? Show me. I will kiss there and the pain will go. He kissed her arms. Here. She seized her little one and clasped him to her heart. She felt so very, very happy. How they loved her little ones, her own flesh of her flesh, blood of her blood. She had given them her lifeblood to make them grow. These little beings who had taken their shape and their life within her womb. She sighed as she thought she had not created life this time. After all, what else was there in her dreary, miserable life? Poverty, starvation, misery, grief, pain, but for the children who loved her, the husband who cared for her. Yes, this was the treasure of her life. The visitors' time was up and they had to leave. She followed them with her eyes as they passed out of the door of her ward. The next morning he found her lying quiet and calm, but she was paler than ever. Her face was yellow, as if turmeric water had been sprinkled on it. It looked as though all the blood had been sucked from her body. A nurse came in and, pricking her thumb, took a drop of blood. Absorbing it on a paper, she examined the percentage of hemoglobin in her blood. The lady doctor came in just at that time and examined it too. The doctor turned almost furiously on him. Can't you see the danger your wife is in? She went on in English, can you imagine that? You never gave her liver extract injections, never gave her tonics during pregnancy. And when she is beyond all hope of recovery, you bring her here. And I suppose you will blame us for her death. Every word of the lady doctor fell like a hammer stroke on his heart. He did not love his wife? He did not care for her? He never gave her tonics and injections? A petty clerk, how could he afford tonics and injections for his wife? And she was reduced to this condition. She was near death, near death. Oh, hell is poverty. He no longer went by bus to his office, but walked all the way. He stopped smoking his cheap cigarettes. And with the few annas that he saved, he bought fruit. He borrowed money and paid for her injections. But she lay there pale and weak as ever, a most deathly pale. Her face was bleached white. Her body was cold and numb. Warm leather gloves and stockings were drawn on her hands and legs. Hot water bottles and bags were kept under her feet. One could feel the presence of something invisible hovering over her. Some foreboding of death. Yet she had a faint, reassuring smile for him. As he sat by, looking at her, pain reflected in his eyes. He comforted her, "You'll get well. I'll take good care of you. I'll give you tonics and fruit. I'm saving money, you know." And very sadly she smiled at him, "Yes, I'll get well," a ray of hope. Maybe this hope would keep her candle of life still burning. But the next moment he realized that her smile was a forced smile, her eyes had a faraway look. And then came the critical night. Her calm gave way to groans. That night she moaned and groaned ceaselessly, piteously. He saw the crisis coming. He begged the nurses and doctors to let him stay with her that one night. They didn't listen to his entreaties. That was against the hospital rules. Moreover, it wasn't a special ward that anybody could be allowed to stay with the patient. A nurse came in and gave her tablets for sleep, shouting at her brutally, "Can't you be quiet? You're groaning horribly. Don't you realize the patients in other wards are being disturbed? The patients in the other wards." Why couldn't she come out with the whole truth? The patients in the special wards, the chosen few, and this treatment was meted out to him because he was poor. He was not of the chosen few, he thought bitterly as he trotted home. Her groans haunted him. And as he lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, he could hear that piteous moaning all night long. Next morning she was calm again. Did it mean that the crisis was over? He thought hopefully. But the lady doctor examined her and shook her head in despair. "There's only one hope left." "What is it, doctor?" he asked madly. "Blood transfusion. Please examine my blood, doctor. If it suits her." And the doctor looked at this man from head to foot. Would he give his blood, this lean, lanky man? He seemed to have very little of it himself. But his beseeching, melting look seemed to answer, he would. "I would give any quantity of my blood, if it could save her life." A few hundred cubic centimeters of blood were drawn from his body and transfused into hers. As her husband's blood, every drop of which contained the warmth of his love, passed through her veins, she gained a little warmth. She seemed to revive. He touched her head. It was warm, it was warm. He bent over her and whispered softly, "You will recover now, surely." She gave him a warm smile, she had understood everything. She thanked him with her eyes and she opened her lips to say something. Her lips trembled, she turned blue and her whole body passed through violent convulsions so that it shook all over. She dug her nails in the sheets. He caught hold of her and bent over her. She wanted to say something, but her lips just parted and trembled. Perhaps she was asking for her children. In his dismay, this thought flashed through his mind. He asked the female neighbors, who had come along with him, to go and get the children. Their house was not far off. They were soon brought there. She looked at them one by one. She tried to stretch her arms out towards the youngest one but her arms fell, lifeless. She looked at him for the last time, as though she were bidding him goodbye. And then all was over. Beating his head, he called out her name again and again. But soon he realized he was in the hospital. He shouldn't behave like this. And then there were the children. He should keep calm in front of them. He let himself fall on a chair. The children stood by their father's chair and stared at the body of their mother. The mystery of death was beyond their understanding. He sat staring at her, too, as the nurses were covering her with white sheets, and a face as white as those sheets. White face and thick black hair falling on her shoulders. He stared and stared. He was oblivious to his surroundings. Faintly, very faintly, he caught a few words that were being spoken around him. It was the lady doctor who was saying, "It's too late at night. You may take the body home tomorrow. Meanwhile the corpse will be laid in the mortuary. We're sorry we couldn't save her life, and you can pay the bill later." And the depressed class women, who bore the corpses down, were shrieking, "We shan't take it down unless we're paid first." And he heard the nurses saying to each other, "After all, we've seen so many deaths here, it never gave us a fright to see a dead body. We're used to it. But look at her. Don't you feel?" They whispered something. They were insulting her even in death. Suddenly he got up and lifted the body in his arms. Somebody brought forward the stretcher. He pushed it aside. And passing by all who stood staring at him astonished and shocked, he carried her body to the stairs leading down to the backyard. A few days back, how many days was it? He had brought her up the stairs, supporting her, holding her tight. He had made her ascend the stairs and now, bearing her lifeless body in his arms, he was going down. There was life in this body once. Why, even a few moments ago. Now it was cold and stiff and heavy in death. He had loved this body, loved it for 10 years, and now she was lost to him forever. How often had he carried this body in his arms when it was light and soft and warm? She was hardly 14 when she came to him as a bride. His mother was alive then. She made her work all day. When his mother was out visiting relatives, they had a gay time. He would lift her in his arms and whirl her round. Those happy days had come to an end too soon. Hard work and childbearing had made her very weak, she was constantly ill. He asked her not to work so hard, but she wouldn't listen to him. When she was at her work, he would go behind her stealthily, lift her up gently and lay her on her bed so that she might rest. Yes, so often. And now he was bearing this body in his arms for the last time. He was bearing her down the stairs. The stairs were narrow and dark. There was darkness all about him. The darkness of night, the darkness of death. The steps seemed never ending. A long way down, down, down. A long descent. The last descent.